We got to start on time. People are still in the wait room, so as I speak, I will try to admit people as well. And I'll do my best to accommodate everybody. Welcome. It is Sunday. It is May. Professor Liptz is here from Israel, right? You're still there? I can see you.
Yeah.
This is the fourth program that we're hosting with Professor Liptz, who was our one-month scholar here this past January when life was very different. This is the first of our second series. We just finished a three-part series entitled Politics and Politicians. This is Creating a Nation. We're going to explore three different subgroups in Israel. Today's subgroup is the Iraqi Jews. Next week at the same time, same location, same Zoom access link and password that you all have already. We'll explore Moroccan Jews, and then we'll finish up the following Sunday, 2 Sundays from now, with American Jews. This program is sponsored by the Community Scholar Program, which is a program that we started here in Orange County almost exactly 20 years ago. I want to thank all of our donors who've supported us for many years. We'll be starting our 20th annual fundraising drive in just a few weeks, so please support us so we can do great programs. We anticipate doing lots online for the next year while we address our current pandemic situation. And even going forward, we anticipate doing many programs now online. The online platform has been terrific. I also wanted to thank our major underwriter, the Jewish Community Foundation of Orange County, for helping to underwrite this program and our certain series of programs. This program is also co-sponsored with Temple Beth Shalom of Needham. My good friend Peter Mesnick has facilitated that. So that's terrific. Welcome aboard, Boston people. And I heard you have nice weather today, so thank you for staying inside, joining us today. Although technically there's not many places you can go right now, but you could go outside for a walk. So hopefully you enjoyed your walk earlier today and you can walk afterwards. We are dedicating this series in honor of Mike Lefkowitz. Many of you know Mike from our community. He's a staunch supporter of Israel and Zionist. Mike fell and injured himself seriously right before the pandemic. I understand he is out of the ICU and has been recovering. We want to dedicate this series to Mike and to a quick healing. We hope to see Mike very soon online and then in person. Upcoming programs I wanted to mention. May 3rd, which is today at 4 p.m., we're doing our first ever CSP online pizza making program with Scott Wiener. Those of you who join us in New York know Scott is the pizza maven of all New York City, if not the world. And he's going to show us today how to make dough for pizza. The dough we'll put in our fridge, and then on Tuesday, he'll reappear at our second part of our workshop and we'll make pizza for dinner. If you haven't signed up and you want to join us, you can register. I think you should all have the link. I'll try to drop it into this chat as well shortly. Danny Matt, world expert in Kabbalah and the Zohar. He translated the whole Zohar into English. He is going to be with us on Monday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time to 1:30, talking about his new research, Elijah the Prophet, the Man Who Never Died. I hope you will join us for that program. May 5th, it's a busy week. 12:30 to 1:30, Robbie Greengrass is back. Everything you need to know about Israel through the songs of Kobe Oz and T-Pax. We're doing a three-part series about music in Israel with Robbie. We did one already. This is focusing on Kobe Oz, so you learn about Israel through Kobe Oz and his music. May 6th, Carol Isaacs, who actually is in our program right now as a spectator in the audience, will be our featured speaker. The Wolf of Baghdad, the story of a lost homeland and of a family's memories. She's a very talented artist. She has a comic strip in the New Yorker. She's a musician and has played with groups like the Indigo Girls. She has her own klezmer group. She'll be live from London, from England. Actually, I shouldn't say London, I assume London, somewhere in England with us. So I hope you'll join us for that program on May 6th. Then we have on May 7th, Rabbi Avi Strasberg is back. Sex, relationships, and so on, according to the rabbis. It's a 5-part series. This is the third part that we'll be doing on May 7th. So everyone is muted. I think what we'll do is what we've done in the past. We're going to do a 45-minute presentation. If you have questions as we go along, you can put them in the chat, and we'll kind of focus on that. I'll keep track of that. At the end of the program, you'll have a chance to send your questions, or I'll read them to the professor, and he'll answer them very handily. And I'll have a few other quick announcements after the program, so don't run away. Professor Paul Liptz is a social historian and CSP's recent 19th annual one-month scholar in residence. He was on the Tel Aviv University faculty for 40 years, teaching graduate and undergraduate students in the Department of Middle East and African History and the International School, where he dealt with a wide range of topics. His main interests are history of the Yishuv, pre-state Israel, the modern state of Israel, and Arab women and nationalism in the Middle East. And he is a CSP favorite. People keep coming back, Professor. So thank you for being with us. And I hope that, do you all have on the screen the presentation in full mode so you can see it right now? Just raise your hand so I can see it and just wave to me so I know, or give me a thumbs up. It's good to go?
We can see it.
Okay. So with that, Professor Liptz, take us to the story of the Iraqi Jews in Israel.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the three-part series. The topic's very interesting. When I arrived in Israel in 1967 as a new immigrant, being an immigrant, I wanted to learn about other immigrants. So I spent a lot of time going out and speaking to people. And one of the issues which will come up tonight and next week as well is the fact of this tremendous migratory movement just before the state of Israel was created and a few years afterwards. So when you hear any expression by anyone, which I understand why they say, why were we treated so badly, which immigrants often feel, by the way, regardless of which country they're going to. One of the things that we have to realize about Israel is that immigrants were coming in vast numbers. And something that will come up as we're going, looking at the Iraqi Jews in particular, at the time that they came in, most of them, 1950, 1951, was a time when the population of Israel doubled. Population of Israel doubled in 3 years. So that means it was absolutely chaotic. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two, that there was a war between November 1947 to January 1949. So you're bringing in people in the middle of a war. And the third challenge, which is very much part of our topic, is that people were coming from different countries, very different kind of countries. And if truth be told, both Iraqi Jews and Moroccan Jews suffered in particular because the main Jewish population at that time were Ashkenazim, majority of them coming from Eastern Europe. And they didn't have one clue at all about what was going on in the Middle East. Before the Shoah, before the Holocaust, Middle Eastern Jewry, they were 15%, 15% of the Jewish world. So they weren't an important group. And many people hadn't studied them. And suddenly, as a result of what was going on in North Africa and Middle Eastern countries, a mass of people suddenly turned up, and that brought about tremendous confusion. I am not trying to deny for a moment that for immigrants coming in the early years, it was terribly difficult, and we'll be dealing with that as we go through. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. And the next slide shows us something about the tremendous changes. Ari, have you moved it on? Thanks. So we see here what is important for us to remember about Iraqi Jews. You see, all of us look at ourselves in terms of our history. And most of us remember the great days of our history and not the bad days. The Iraqi Jews have good reason to remember the great days, right from the very early period. We have the Jews at the end of the First Temple period being kicked out of the land of Israel. Many of them going to Iraq, to the area of Babylonia. And when the time came that Cyrus the Great said to the Jewish people, you can go back to your homeland now. It was a good deal, by the way. A considerable number of them decided not to go back to the Holy Land, probably making a good decision, because those who went with Ezra and Nehemiah found that they went into an extremely tough condition, and the whole question of who was married to who became a problem. So those who stayed because sticking around in Babylonia in Iraq was the sensible decision. Next slide, please. As part of what we see is the tremendous development of the Bavli Talmud. Now, I'm sure some of you have studied Talmud, and if you do an analysis between the two sets of Talmud, the Yerushalmi, the Jewish Jerusalem, Eretz Israel Talmud, or the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, we know that the Babylonian Talmud is by far the best, much more serious, longer, more detailed, and it consists of about 2,700 double-page, folios, which is, as we know, the basic concept of what Judaism is. So at a very early stage, the Babylonian Jews, the Iraqi Jews, have an impressive source, at least from the 6th century. They can develop their Judaism to a very high level. Now, what happens as time goes by, Jews living in other parts of the world, for example, the largest Jewish community from about the 10th, 11th century was in Poland, Eastern Europe. And they knew about the Bavli Talmud, but they didn't really relate the Bavli Talmud with the people of Iraq. So even when later on they met Iraqi Jews, they didn't put those two things together, which the Iraqi Jews obviously resented. Next slide, please. Ari, are you here? Can you see listening? That's right, the dhimmis. So what was the status of the Iraqi Jews and generally the Jews of the Middle East? And by the way, here there's a major controversy that continues till today. The Islamic society is divided into 3 sections. At the top you have the Muslims, the second level are people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, and the third are the infidels. School A says, wow, the Jews and the Christians are so lucky because they're not infidels. So we've welcomed them into our fold. However, for many Jews and Christians, they didn't want to be the second level because there were a lot of disadvantages, taxation disadvantages, clothing disadvantages. And between the Jews and the Christians, it was better to be a Christian because you were part of a major people in the world. The Jews were a small group with no homeland. So we have this book by Bat Yor, which is an important book, which belongs to the second school of thought. So, which says basically, it wasn't great to be a dhimmi, a so-called protected person. Being protected under Islam at that time wasn't much fun at all. By the way, I've been involved in some very interesting discussion with Muslim scholars who've tried to convince me that Jews should be happy all the time, having lived under Islam, which was a lot better than living under Christianity. And that argument certainly has some validity. Next slide, please. As we move on after the Talmudic period into the 9th and 12th century, we begin to see just how much there was a golden age in Iraq. Somewhat similar, by the way, to the golden age in Spain, more or less the same time period. 9th to 12th century in Spain, we see Islam at a very progressive level, and that kind of situation existed in Iraq as well. So first you have the central yeshivot, Surah and Pumbedita, very, very simple central yeshivot, which influenced much of the Jewish world in the Middle East at that time. Benjamin of Tudela, who was an amazing person, and in the early period, 12th century, we have almost no one who gives us some sort of broader perspective. He tells us that in Iraq there were 40,000 Jews and 28 synagogues and 10 yeshivot. We know, by the way, in those days, figures were pretty much exaggerated. So even if you cut that down by 50% or even a little bit more, we find in Iraq a well-established large community. Even if it was 20,000 Jews, that's an impressive group. And we're beginning to see something which is pretty much true of Jewish history in almost all parts of the world: skilled people, The realms that they were involved in tended to be realms where one needed an education. That's one component. The other component, by the way, is that because Jews are a mobile people, they're moving from country to country, they're picking up information from other Jews. And that's very important. They know more than one language. And that's really the kind of the basis, which although we're talking about Iraq, we can draw that conclusion with other countries as well. Medicine, pharmacy, goldsmiths, and certainly being in trade allows these Jews to move up to become an impressive group. And that, by the way, is going to be very important for our story when we get to the 20th century. New slide, please. There was a great division between two groups of Jews. You have the main Iraqi Jewish community based in Baghdad and Basra. Those are the two big cities with Jewish community. And they were very different from the Jews in the north, the Kurdish Jews. Kurdish Jews were much more traditional, living very, very closely with the local Kurdish Muslim population. By the way, the Kurds then and until today are clearly Muslims, but not very theological. They're not really so interested in what's written in the textbooks. They're not so well educated either, but they have a kind of a folkloristic Islam, which is important. And the Jewish Kurds lived very, very well. Many, many centuries later, the Zionist movement was going to look at the Kurdish Jews with a great deal of joy because they were rural people. And Zionism was based on developing the land. So when they looked at Iraqi Jews and they found there were Kurdish Jews who had actually worked the land, they said, wow, this is good. We can kind of bring them onto the kibbutz. By the way, the few who went onto the kibbutz found it wasn't quite what they expected. But that's another story. Next slide, please. So here we get the development of modernity. The Alliance Israélite Universelle is a major, major project which begins in Paris in the 1860s. And the idea of the AIU, which is often known by, was to go to Middle Eastern countries in particular and educate them. And there was a little bit of paternalism going on there, somewhat condescending. They regarded the Middle Eastern Jews as somewhat, to use a word which is not politically correct today, primitive, and to really give them a good French education. They were interested in making Jews of the Middle East, and we'll see this next week when we look at Morocco, the same model. They were interested in making the people, the Jewish people, much more modern. And they were particularly interested in women, in girls. And that's an important point because when they looked at the Jewish community in the Middle East, they found that in certain cases, girls were getting married at the age of 12. By the way, in Islam in those days, that was an acceptable age. Muhammad even married a young girl of 9. But so the Jewish people are obviously being influenced by Islam, as Jews are always influenced by the norms of the society they're living in. And the AIU comes and says, we're really going to move the Jews forward. Now, the picture indicates something which is quite different from the local Muslim society of the time. Well-dressed, very withered kind of clothing. We're talking about the end of the 19th century, the very early stage of the 20th century. Well-dressed and trying, and they will be, as we'll see a little later, very much part of the Baghdad and Basra elite. So the AIU will come up in a number of occasions in today's session and next week as well. Next slide, please. The major change comes when the British enter 1917. 1970 is a big year for the Jewish people because of the Balfour Declaration. But in Iraq, it isn't really, so they're not at this stage so concerned about the Balfour Declaration, but they're very concerned about the British. Iraq had been under Ottoman and other control over the years, and suddenly the British come in. Remember, this is the period of the Great British Empire, Britain that ruled the waves, and the Jewish population are happy that the British have come in and that the British will be there till 1932 when Iraq becomes independent. But there's another reason why the Jews are extremely important. The British, wherever they settle, they're major imperialists and colonialists. They never have enough people to run the civil service. And the civil service is a central component of the British existence. And the reason the British had so much influence was because they had an effective civil service. The Jews were ideal civil servants, already literate, prepared to learn languages, very modern compared with most of the other people, and they were part of a large percentage of the population in Baghdad. So in a certain sense, the period 1917 to 1932 is a kind of golden age for Jews, but there were certain issues which didn't make them happy. The Jews were interested in receiving British citizenship or becoming British subjects, and the British weren't interested in it. Remember, the British are already becoming a little skeptical of the Jews because of what's going on in Palestine at that time, and the tensions developing between the Zionist movement and the British rulers. So they're not jumping for joy to help the Jew in all realms, but certainly if it's to their advantage of developing their bureaucracy, that's what they're going to do. So this is a good period for the Jewish population, but, and this is often the case, the local Muslims are beginning to say, what's going on with the Jews? They're having special advantages. They're getting British salaries, essentially. They're receiving social benefits, and they're developing quicker than we are. So even in the 1930s, we're beginning to see the early stages of anti-Semitism based on envy, and in certain cases, based on the fact that in the Quran, in the Muhammad invites the Jews into the religion of Islam, and it doesn't work so well. And therefore, there's an historical tension which exists right from the early days of the 6th century, late 6th century and early 7th century, when we see the tension between Islam and Judaism. By the way, two religions which have many commonalities about them. Next slide, please. To see what it means during the British mandatory period, look at the population in Baghdad. 1917, 50% Muslim, 40% Jews, 6% Christians. Therefore, the Muslims were in the smaller places, in the villages, small towns. Jews normally come into the large cities. And not only were they in the large city, but they had a majority on city council. So the Jews had local political power, not national power, which is already becoming a little bit awkward for the local Muslim population. As I mentioned earlier, the Jews are becoming civil servants, and there is also at the same time, so we've got two factors which are going to be problematic. One is that the Jews are a minority group, but with majority power in Baghdad. That's one problem. And the other problem is that then we begin to see the very early stages of Zionism. Iraqi Jews, literate, well aware of what was going on in the world, start from the 1920s to go to Israel on Aliyah, and they have organized Zionist organizations in the cities of Iraq at that time. Next slide, please. We're going to see some pictures just to give a sense. And you know, when we come to the 1950s and we ask why was there a negative attitude by many of the Jews living in Israel, it's because of the image. When you get used to the clothing of a population, you really don't ask too many questions. But for the Zionists looking at the people dressed like this, the regular clothing, by the way, if you're living in the Middle East at the time of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it's just how people dress. It's natural Middle Eastern dress. but it's going to be develop a stereotype. We'll talk about stereotypes a little later. Next slide, please. This is a traditional family. Now, if you don't know they're Jewish, they look like Arabs, but that's understandable. You're living in the Middle East, you're a small minority group, you don't want to go around the country looking too different. Remember, we're talking about tough times. And so this is basically the clothing that you're going to have. Now, traditional, in our terms, might seem something different. Well, the term that I'm using it here, the sociological term I'm using here, is basically saying, like most other people. That is what traditional is here. So this is how many of them dressed. And some of them were going to arrive in Israel sometime later, looking somewhat like these people. Not necessarily a large number, but they were certainly there. Next slide. Here we have another side of the Iraqi population, and that's the Sassoon family. The Sassoons were described as the Rothschilds of the Middle East. This is a picture of them living in Shanghai. Very interesting picture. One son is already dressed in very modern clothing. The other ones are dressing in regular clothing. And the father, David Sassoon, who was a multi-billionaire and a major philanthropist, is sitting on the chair, still at that time in Shanghai, wearing traditional Middle Eastern clothing. We'll now see a different kind of clothing as we go on to the next slide. And here we see the Jewish elite. Now, the question of elite is a fascinating question. Sociologists are always amazed by it. Because what elites really do is establish a norm, but they're not a majority. Elites are always minorities. And if you look at these people at that time, very smartly dressed, mainly men, but a woman also in modern clothing, these people could be living anywhere in the world. And this is an important point. Iraqi Jews actually saw themselves as international. Although they were very much based in the Middle East, the fact that they'd had this period of about 15 years of British rule, the fact that they were traders and traveling around the world, gave them the feeling that they were international. They weren't just local Iraqis. So this is kind of the division which we begin to see within the Iraqi society, and it will play itself out when they get to Israel. Next slide, please. Look at the girls, the young women. Wow, what does that say? Private school. You tell me in the 1930s or 40s, these people couldn't be in England or America or any other Western country of the world. Very well organized. And by the way, many of these young women brought those lovely clothes with them to Israel. And we'll talk about a little later when they get on the kibbutz, the tensions which develop between the two cultures coming together. Kibbutzim in the 1950s, very relaxed clothing, khaki shorts and shirts and things. And these women would bring their clothing in. We must add one other point, that these people are essentially religious, not necessary as we would understand modern orthodoxy today, certainly not Haredi. You have almost no phenomenon of real Haredi as we understand it today in the Middle East, but they're all religious without even thinking of that being what they are, but that's their basic norms of society. So modern and religious at one and the same time. Next slide, please. Here comes the shock, the Farhud. It's a pogrom. The Farhud comes about because, as I've been mentioning, there's a seething anger towards the Jews. Now, there are a number of explanations on the Farhud, and today we have a significant amount of research which essentially would describe two components that brought about the pogrom. By the way, the pogrom was based in Baghdad. About 180 Jews were killed. The shock for the Jewish population was tremendous. They saw themselves as acculturating to to wider society. They saw themselves having moved ahead under the British, and they believed that even though Iraq became independent in 1932, they were fully accepted. They also didn't realize that this is the period of rising Arab nationalism. This is the period during the Second World War where it's clear that there are definite signs that a Jewish state would be coming about in the Middle East. Something Zionism was totally abhorrent to them. And so on the one hand, the Farhud comes about because of what the Jews are doing in the eyes of the local Iraqi population. And the other reason we'll see in the next slide. Next slide, please. Which is this one. In the last 20 years or so, the argument of why the Farhud really happened has come very much influenced by this book by Edwin Black and many, many others, which showed that Iraq and the Nazis cooperated with each other. The Nazis moved into a number of Middle Eastern countries. The Nazis firstly needed oil, as did the Western allies. They certainly wanted the British to move. They were British, they weren't the controlling power, but the British were still very much involved in Iraqi affairs. And the Mufti of Jerusalem, Khajaman al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti, very, very influential kind of person, had already established contacts with Hitler, during which he had promised Hitler that at a certain time, Arabs would be taken in to help the Nazis in the war. In the end, by the way, the assistance of the Mufti was very, very minimal. Be it as it may, the Farhud was a tremendous shock. This was the break of what they thought was really going to happen. And as we move on to the next slide, please, we begin to see what the result is. 9 years later, the Iraqi government, realizing that the Jewish population is restless, and some of them had been leaving secretly and illegally, by the way, they'd been leaving illegally from 1941 onwards, decided that they would come out with a useful plan. They would allow the Jews to leave on condition, firstly, they gave up their citizenship, and secondly, they lost all their property. The Jews were wealthy, therefore the government was going to get all the Jewish property. The issue was that within the Iraqi government at the time, the estimation was that only a small number of Jews would leave. After all, 1950, the State of Israel has just been created 2 years earlier. The economic position in Israel was absolutely terrible. And so when they looked at what would happen, they said, look, we're going to let a small number of Jews leave. By the way, they didn't want too many Jews to leave because the Jews were important for running the country and the components of modernization which the Jews played a role in. And but they misevaluated. They thought some of the figures that you see, the Iraqi Minister of Interior suggested that maybe 5,000 or 6,000 Jews would leave. At the same time, 1950, the State of Israel was created. It's seen as a great threat to the Arab world. A few years later, Gamal Abdel Nasser will become the president of Egypt, which would incite the Middle Eastern area even more. And therefore, the offense for being a Zionist was very problematic, and sometimes you would even be killed for that reason. Next slide, please. So, Ezra and Nehemiah, the Ezra and Nehemiah, the term that we saw right at the beginning, appears again. The last time was when they went back in the very early period, Second Temple period. Here, March 1950 to December 1951, Ezra and Nehemiah is different. They go by plane, sometimes directly to Israel, sometimes via Cyprus, sometimes in other ways. We find them going in secretly in boats as well. And it was a very, very significant figure. 114,000 people arrived there. In 1951, that would have been something like 10 or 15% of the population who just arrived essentially overnight. Here we begin to move into some of the serious problems. The arrival of the Jews in Iraq in 1950s is a major crisis, in a sense, for both sides. A lack of understanding, lack of information. Let me just jump ahead. 1967, when I arrived in Israel, I wanted to learn about these things. I was a graduate student at Tel Aviv at Hebrew University then, and I wanted to study the Jews in the Middle East, and I could hardly find a course. This is in the late 60s. So Israel paid very, very little attention to this group, and that enabled stereotypes to develop. Once again, if we look at the picture, well-dressed, very modern kind of people, and they were moving in vast numbers to a country which had very poorly developed infrastructure. And that was going to be one of the reasons for the crisis for Iraqi Jews, which many of them, the elder people and their children, grandchildren, still speak about in Israel today. Next slide. Here we see them arriving in Israel. Now, some of them, the picture isn't all that clear, but the reason I chose that picture is that we see the Iraqi Jewish population is divided. Some of these people would come from villages or poorer populations in Baghdad. I'm sure some of them were arriving from the northern Kurdish area. And the Israeli population, faced suddenly by all these kind of groups coming in, tended to be very, very confused. And, stereotypes are a problematic issue. When the word gets out of a certain image about a people, it's very, very hard to change. And this is, in a sense, what happened here. The majority of the Israeli Ashkenazi elite hadn't had this slide session now. It wasn't part of their background, part of their education. So here we have them forming an idea, oh, Middle Eastern people, they must be poorly educated. And that's really where the crisis of the 1950 arrives. People arriving quickly, and from the Ashkenazi elite's perspective, they were most concerned with Holocaust survivors. Very significant amount of Holocaust survivors had arrived. In fact, in 1951, 1 out of every 4 Jews in Israel was a Holocaust survivor. And Ashkenazim clearly related to them as being very important. They were from the countries that the political elite belonged to. And therefore, those who came from other parts of the world were in many cases forgotten, which we'll see with the coming slide. And what was going to happen, we were going to see some, not all came. They were going to Israel, but 9,000 remained. In 2018, it's believed that there's 6 Jews still remaining in Iraq. By the way, there's a wonderful 35-minute YouTube production about a handful of men praying at Rosh Hashanah in this Mir Twig synagogue. And it's really a bad situation, but the Jews of Iraq are going to leave. By the way, as time went by, the position in Iraq got even worse, and anyone who was even suspected of having contact with the Zionist country, Israel, could well find themselves in jail or hung. Public hangings went on at that time. Next one, please. Where did they arrive? From the luxury of Baghdad, they found themselves in the transit camps, 10 cities, in Hebrew, Ma'barot. And what was happening in this period, we're talking 1950, 1951, on many days of the week, 1,000 immigrants arrived. There was no planning. They didn't know when they were going to come and how they were going to come. And suddenly you'd have a boat coming in, or a plane, or in many cases, even walking, by the way, suddenly would arrive. There was no infrastructure. Israel was very, very poor at that time, a terrible, poverty-stricken society. And the only thing that could really be done was to put the people into 10 cities. Now, you can imagine what it was like coming from comfortable Baghdad or Basra society and thinking you're coming back to your homeland. Remember, this is return to the Holy Land. And here what they're finding is they're going to be in 10 cities. These 10 cities change slowly. And in the next slide, we'll see some of the very slow developments. Here we see a year later or so, the transit camps are no longer tent cities, but with very, very basic structures. Once again, some of the people would find themselves in these camps for many years. There was nowhere to go. They were stuck there. Stuck there in some cases that they would write afterwards, and until today, complain about the officials, the bureaucrats, who had no understanding of them. By the way, just to mention a few of the crises which they faced, they might have known biblical Hebrew, which was very different from modern Hebrew. They wouldn't know what many of the elite knew, which was Yiddish, even if Yiddish was kind of moving out of its popularity at that time. You should always throw in a few words in Yiddish. That was very much the norm. These people didn't know Yiddish. And not only that, there was the crisis when they would speak Arabic. And we have a considerable number of stories when children told their mothers and fathers, please don't speak Arabic when our friends are here. Remember, Arabic is the language of the enemy, and it just wasn't the kind of thing that you wanted your friends to know about. So this is a very, very tough kind of period. Problem with not only with language, but with food. They didn't like Ashkenazi knedlach and those kind of things. So there's this food issue, and it was very, very hard to leave the transit camps because there was already an overpopulation. The infrastructure of Israel in the 1950s wasn't adequately developed for the influx of this very large number of people coming from all over the world. So just from my perspective, having studied this over the years, I think I understand both sides. I think I understand the administration coping with this influx of people who they really didn't understand and with very limited resources. And at the same time, I certainly understand what it must have been like for these Iraqis with their coming from their nice schools, suddenly being thrown into these conditions. And by the way, not being able to go home. In my third session, we'll be talking about American immigrants to Israel. And we'll see there that with the American immigrant, if you don't like Israel, you go back home. That's absolutely fine. Not in this case. North African, Middle Eastern Jews could not go home. They were not allowed. They had no longer citizenship. They no longer had any possessions there. So that was going to make their position very difficult. Next slide, please. What were they going to do? Well, at most they could do physical work. These are people, urban people, unlike the Kurdish ones, by the way. The Kurdish had been physical workers, but the Kurds were a small number, small percentage of the larger Iraqi population. Suddenly you had people who were lawyers and doctors, literally finding themselves having to do some work, and they're doing the physical work there. No preparation, and it's not only very difficult, but very, very humiliating. We look at immigrant trends around the world, people talk about the sense of humiliation, the sense that the local population didn't ask any questions. They didn't want to know about us as immigrants. And that was certainly what we see with these Iraqis. And it's particularly prominent, obviously, when you're talking about an urban middle-class population which migrates to another part of the world that has no understanding of what they're all about. Next slide, please. Salah Shabati, an amazing movie. If you ever have a chance to see what's called a comedy in Israel, by the way, it's not politically correct. 1964, political correctness was poorly developed. Slicha Shabati is a play on the words. Sorry That I Came. Chaim Topol, by the way, is the hero there. Very, very clever movie. If you take away some of the non-political correct components, it's an anthropological movie in some ways, showing the confusion which an Iraqi or a Moroccan, it could be anyone from the Middle East, who suddenly comes into this modern Israeli society. So if you have a chance, Salah Shabati with English subtitles is a good movie to try and get a sense of some of the things that I'm talking about here. By the way, in the movie, Salah Shabati may move into a kind of a tent city. It's already the second stage, Mabara, a transit area. And so it's good to see it visually. Next slide, please. Now, what did the Iraqi Jews do? We're running ahead now. The 50s are over. By the 60s and the 70s in particular, those who had been middle-class Iraqis learned very quickly, because of who they were, the rules of the game, and started getting involved in Israeli politics. So we have in the 60s and 70s already a small number of Iraqi Jews who are in politics, sometimes in fairly responsible situations, pretty high level, and they were becoming the interpreters between the Ashkenazi elite and the wider Iraqi people. By the way, in immigrant absorption, we know that a very small number of those intermediaries can be extremely important in explaining to both sides what's happening. We know by this, by the way, when we look at the Ethiopians in Israel, if we have some Ethiopian intermediaries fluent in Hebrew, explaining to the bureaucracy and to their own people in Amharic what's happening, that's very important. This particular museum, which if you go to Israel and you have the time, in Or Yehuda, about a 20-minute drive from Tel Aviv, it's an absolutely amazing museum. It's the Babylonian Jewish Heritage Site. It's a research center. They have lectures there. I actually gave a lecture there about a year ago. Very, very nice conditions, absolutely beautiful. And the idea of the museum, by the way, museums are very political. This museum really shows how much the Iraqis were the elite, trying to explain to the Israeli visitor who doesn't know what we've been talking about now, and at the same time ensuring that the memory of the past is retained. Next slide, please. And here we see just a little bit of part of the museum. On the one hand, the message is, please remember that we were middle class, that we were just like you people. And at the same time, there are these models and pictures of the tent. I can assure you that the transit tents, the tent cities of the 1950s were not nearly as nice as the tent that we are seeing there. But this is once again a museum, which is an educational museum, besides being museums, which museums often are. And this is really kind of part of this new Iraqi elite. The Iraqis, by the way, live on the outskirts. The middle-class Iraqis live on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, very, very well integrated into Israeli society. And it's very hard for someone like myself, not born in Israel, to even know that an Iraqi would be an Iraqi, because many of their traits and actions would just seem that they're from any other part of the world and not necessarily from the Middle East. Next slide, please. Here we have two of our representatives. Moshe Levi, the first Mizrahi. By the way, the term Mizrahi is someone who comes from North Africa and the Middle East. Sometimes we hear the word Sfardi. So you use Sfardi or Sfardim, plural, or Mizrahi or Mizrahim. Most times now one increasingly uses the word Mizrahi, because Sfardi actually means someone who comes from Sfarad, from Spain. So we had Moshe Levi, the first chief of staff from a Mizrahi background, and Shlomo Hillel, he was the speaker in the Knesset. So very much involved, by the way, in the early days. The elite were in the Mapai party, the leftist party, later to be called the Labour Party, from 1977 onwards, they joined the Likud party under Menachem Begin, because Begin in the 1950s, as an opposition politician, had been very, very involved in the North African Jews. And so when he eventually came into power in 1977, there was a major move of votes over to the right-wing parties, and Menachem Begin was absolutely their hero, although he's very Polish, but he was certainly their hero. Next slide, please. Two others. Dali Itzik sitting with Shimon Peres, very central once again in the Labour Party. This early upward mobility that you find through the political system is very profound. And then we can see Eli Amir. Eli Amir is one of the 4 or 5 famous Iraqi writers. And Eli Amir, a terrific human being. He was once suggested as the possibility for the position of president in Israel. Eli Amir wrote an amazing book about what it was to be an Iraqi child on a kibbutz. So on the one hand, you would say, well, aren't they lucky? The kibbutz accepted them. But he writes about the tensions and the fact that the kibbutz children really didn't understand who these Iraqis were, looked at them as some sort of lower class kind of people. And there's some interesting little stories. Just one, for example, the first Shabbat on a kibbutzim are by and large not religious. The Iraqi children would put on their best clothes, the clothes they had specially brought from Iraq for Shabbat. And the kibbutz children laughed. There wasn't a synagogue on most of the kibbutz, and they didn't know what it was. So the cultural tensions which develop are written about by some of the writers, and Eli Amir is a favorite. If any of you want to get into the topic, you can find translation of some of his books in English. The next slide, please. I can see I'm going over time, but just this, almost the end. Iraq and Israel do not have good relations, but I'm putting this picture in just to speak about a possibility for the future. Maybe when we're living in a happier Middle East, which I very much want to happen, we have this lovely story of Miss Israel and Miss Iraq meeting at the beauty competition and becoming very good friends. And Miss Iraq came to Jerusalem, and they were good friends. So in a positive, futuristic dream world that I sometimes live in, this might be 2 friends, and maybe we'll have more friends in the future. The very last slide is coming now, and then we've got some time for questions. Just a very, very quick summary of some of the issues. I've spoken about them, but just maybe your eyes can pick them up as well. The role of memory, officials not understanding them, the role of Arabic, which I mentioned earlier. Women, by the way, coping better with men than men. We often find in immigrant societies that women are more adaptable and keener to go through upward mobility if they haven't had it in their own countries. We had a sad situation of babies disappearing in hospitals, given up without parental consent. It was not a major issue here, but it existed. It was much worse in the case of the Yemenites. Kibbutzim not being in many cases, totally rejecting parents. The children and the parents had to divide each other, and their painful stories of the children returning to their parents' homes and not wanting to be with their parents after they had lived some time in the western kibbutz. Operation Rooftop was an army involvement through the very tough winters in the early 1950s, and the point that I mentioned before, Menachem Begin's sympathy with the Iraqi Jews, which resulted in him receiving electoral support in 1977. Thank you very much. I've gone over my time, but we have a few minutes for any kind of questions. Oh, and I can see all of you. That's lovely. Thank you. I just see a certain number all the time, so it's lovely to see all of you. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Liptz. We'll take a moment for questions, and I'll look at the chat as well. before I look at the chat, I wanted to mention that it just turns out that we're focusing on Iraqi Jews twice this week. So today it's kind of it was the history of Iraqi Jews, but with a focus on their relationship and integration in Israel. And on Wednesday, we have Carol Isaacs, who I hope to find in a minute. And after we do our Q&A, who will tell you about what she's going to talk about, which is really what we started off with, the history of the Jews in Iraq and her family that she, in an artistic way, is going to present to us on Wednesday. Before we get there, when you were here, Professor Liptz, in January, we talked about 4 other communities. We talked about Holocaust survivors, Ethiopian community, Yemenite community, and Russian community. And one of the big issues that and by the way, those presentations were recorded and they're on our OCCSP iTunes podcast. So if you want to catch up, you can go to iTunes, type in OCCSP, and you'll find the presentations. But you ended each program just saying how the communities are faring now. And here you touched on it a bit, but you talked about specific examples. I want to know in general, how is the Moroccan community now accepted in Israel? Are they fully accepted? Are they, if you go to the development towns, do you find them there?
The Iraqis, of all the Middle Eastern and North African communities, were the most successful. If successful as being like mainstream Israelis, which means middle class, studied, got into universities. I just know from my own experience at universities, always had a considerable number of Iraqi faculty people, well placed in high tech, in the legal profession, doctors as well. So their position now, after a very painful period in the 1950s, has been, they've been successful. They're definitely, their background, by the way, the British period was very important for them. Firstly, they had the Alliance school system, and then they had the British. So they therefore had 2 Western languages. So this, by the way, is a fascinating situation, that intermediary period of the British acted as an important component when they got in Israel. You see, they knew English in many cases, and there were those Israelis who knew English because of the British mandatory period, which we'll see next week when we look at the Moroccans. It was a very, very different situation. So the Iraqis are as elite as you can get in many realms of Israeli society today.
And just to go back, I'll try to cover as many questions as possible, but remind us, how many Jews are left in Iraq today?
6.
In all of Iraq, or is that Baghdad?
They say, well, there are just a few others. The number isn't quite clear. I used to hear of the figure 18, and in 2018, the official figure was 6. I imagine there's some Jews who just don't want to tell anyone that they're Jewish because it's not a very popular statement to make. But whatever it is, even if it's very small. By the way, there's an interesting situation with Iraqi Jews. Some of them are hoping that things in Iraq will get better because they want to go back and they want to have a roots program with their families. Like you have Jews in Morocco. It's a very, very big program in Morocco. So, you know, they've got nostalgia, and some of their houses still exist, not exactly as they left it. But you know, that's what they are. But the number is very small. I mean, it's 6 or 10 or 20, you know, somewhere around that.
Rachel Grappo, who I don't know, but welcome to the program, says that the Iraqi part of her family actually walked to Israel. Someone asked, why were babies taken from hospitals? Is this the same issue that we discussed?
Oh, this is a tough one. It's very.
You have like 1 minute to answer.
Okay. I'd love an hour to answer that question. The many cases, because of their condition, the babies were small and underfed, and the babies were in hospitals. And then you have, in some cases, if you talk about tragedy, Holocaust survivor families who had lost their children, who said, if we go in and pick up a little baby from Iraq or from other parts of the Middle East, we will be saving that baby's life. We can give that baby a wonderful situation. Look where their parents are. Their parents are in 10 cities. That isn't the place to bring up a baby. So you have this situation. By the way, in the case of Iraqis, we don't know what the number is, but it doesn't seem to be a very large number. But that's essentially what happened. By the way, there are tragic stories, which one hears, about, once again, the 2 sides of the coin. The Holocaust by the parents who think they're saving the babies' lives, and at long last they've got children, they wanted children. And on the other hand, the Iraqi parents go to the hospital one day and don't find their babies anymore. Tough situation. Building a country is not easy. So that's what it's about. Is that more than 1 minute, I think, Ari? Yeah.
I think so. I'll take away minutes from the next presentation. The camps, the Ma'abarot camps, the transit camps that the Iraqis found themselves in, I assume the other communities were in there as well that you've mentioned when they came.
Yeah, a lot of mixture of communities. But what happened in the Ma'abarot, in the transit camps, that if you came from an ethnic group that had a base in a city, you have you're moving migration. That means, someone, say a German, there were German Jews who arrived there, by the way. They arrived at the time, there was nowhere for them to go after the creation of the state, but there would be Germans in some of the cities in Israel, and the Germans who were settled would bring their own crowd, their own group into their community. To put it in the American sense, it's like when Russian-speaking Jews arrive in the United States and the Jewish community is so helpful. So that kind of phenomenon you find in Israel also. So there were other groups, but you would have groups which had a foster concept, an adoption family concept. They were going to be able to move out, and those who didn't were in much more difficult situation. By the way, there were a certain number of Iraqis who had arrived in the 20s and 30s, but not enough to really bring the mass number of transit residents out of the transit areas into urban Israel.
But going back to those camps, were communities mixed? So you'd have Iraqi and Yemenite and...
You have in the camps, you have a mixture. And by the way, at a later stage, they were taken to moshavim, agricultural settlements. And on the moshavim, the general policy was to mix the groups. It was felt it isn't going to be good if you just have one group. And in fact, I'm over my time, but I must say, I had an amazing experience when we were on a kibbutz at a certain stage, and I used to go one afternoon a week to teach kids on this particular moshav. And they came from two different backgrounds. There were Moroccan children and Kurdish children. And I couldn't understand why only a few were turning up to my English classes. And then I found out that the one group hadn't told the other group that I was there. So only one half of the moshav knew that I was coming, and the others never heard about it. They didn't tell them. This is in the 60s, in the late 60s. So you try and bring groups together, but ethnic tensions are tough. And that's what happened both in the transit camps and in later periods of Israeli society.
And before we hear from Carol Isaacs, just one last question from a visual perspective. I think you said already, but do Iraqi Jews, authentic Iraqi Jews, can you identify them on the street? Do they look like they come from an Arab part of the world? Or is Israel so mixed? You do not look like an Iraqi Jew to me. There you go. You're right. But outside of the Ashkenazi world.
So what you have,
Mizrahi world. Can you differentiate within the Mizrahi world? Is it easy to differentiate?
You think they might be from some part of Europe. It's very likely that what they look like is that they could be part of some sort of European background. And because when they got to Israel after a few years, they started going to the good Hebrew-speaking schools. Their accent was very, very quickly Israeli Hebrew. I mean, even after 53 years in Israel, my Hebrew is, they know that I'm not a local. But that was also very important. It means once you speak Hebrew, especially in the early days, with the Hebrew accent, and we're going to say the non-politically correct word, light-skinned, and living in an urban area, that you kind of assume that they just one of us, that kind of very awkward word. That isn't the case of people coming from other parts of the world.
Right.
So, yeah.
Carol Isaacs, are you there?
Hello, yes, I am.
I don't know if I can see a picture of you yet, but
Yeah, I was going to reboot my computer, but Professor Lipptz's presentation was so fascinating. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. But
so
by Wednesday.
Carol was introduced to me by my friend Peter Mesnick from Temple Beth Shalom, and you spoke there because you have a relative in the area who may be online as well.
Yes.
But Carol, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you'll be talking about on Wednesday, so the group knows why they should tune in before we end our presentation today?
Thank you so much for inviting me, Ari. It's, I'm really excited. My name is Carol. I'm a musician and a cartoonist, and I just released a book, The Wolf of Baghdad. That's the wolf you can see as my profile picture. It's the story of my family experience in Baghdad. I was born in the UK, but both parents come from Baghdad. And it's a graphic novel, and it's also an animation with music. And I did the soundtrack for the music as well.
Wow.
So I'm going to talk a bit about the making of the project, show a little preview of the work, and maybe take some questions and do a little discussion afterwards.
So you're all welcome to join us on Wednesday. I believe our usual time on Wednesday, which would be 12:30, but look in the advertisements. If you're not on our CSP special email list for these distance programs, email me, ariekatz, ARIEKATZ 18, that's 18 @gmail.com. I'll make sure you're on the list. You get invited to everything. So we wanted to welcome our members, our donors, our patrons, and we have so many guests who are new to CSP in Orange County, so welcome, and in California, and now on the East Coast, welcome. Professor Liptz, give us a update or a kind of a marketing piece for what you'll be talking about next week at the same time.
We're speaking about Moroccans, and it's a very different story from the Iraqis. You think all Middle Eastern people, well, they must be Middle Eastern. It's different from as a Yeki to a Russian, tremendous differences. And just one point, which I think is important, is chronology. You know, when sociologists, you think only historians are interested in chronology. But what we find when the sociological part of me is often to realize how important chronology is. And just the one comment I'll make, the Moroccans arrived from about the mid-1950s to up to about 1963. So if I said that Israel was filled up with immigrants when the Iraqis came in 1950-51, you can imagine how difficult it was 10 years later. So I hope I didn't depress you too much today, but I promise you when we get to the Moroccans, we'll see Israel in a more difficult situation. And in the 1960s, Israel faced a tremendous economic crisis. So if you arrived in the 1960s and then a few years later, there was a depression, a serious economic depression, things worked out, it was tough for them. Tougher, without doubt, than the Iraqi experience, which wasn't easy, but a lot easier than what the Moroccans found. And then the week after that, we'll deal with the Americans, which is another story altogether.
The worst group. What I enjoy much about your presentation is the clarity and the trajectory. You take us from on a nice story, so thank you for doing that again. To me, these programs make Israel more beautiful. It's a tapestry. It is not a monolith. And there's so many sub-communities. And when we all go to Israel, hopefully soon, when we can, we're going to experience these different communities in different ways. So thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow when a world expert on the Zohar, the Kabbalah, will be talking about Elijah the prophet, Danny Matt, and then we have Carol Isaacs, and we're off and running this week. Lots of programs to keep you busy. It's beautiful outside. Go for a walk. Don't get too close to anybody. And have a nice Sunday. Those of you who are cooking pizza with me, I'll see you at 4 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Bye.
With you again. Thank you.